This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. Nothing exploded. No sirens went off. And yet something foundational just started to move. Quietly, deliberately, in a place most people never look. Because when power prepares for a real rupture, it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't shout. It withdraws. What's happening right now is not a reaction. It's not panic. It's not market noise. It's a decision being executed slowly enough to avoid attention, but fast enough to matter. And if you've been watching the obvious signals, the visible ones, you've already missed the more important shift underneath them. Tonight, I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm asking you to stay with me. Because once you see this mechanism clearly, you can't unsee where it leads. And what comes next explains why this moment didn't feel dramatic at all, even though it should have. What actually controls this system is not elections, not speeches, not even markets, the way we like to imagine them. It's balance sheets, sovereign ones, because the modern global order isn't enforced by force first. It's enforced by trust, by the assumption that certain assets are neutral, untouchable, safe, no matter what happens next. That assumption is the system, and the danger begins the moment that assumption quietly breaks. Right now, power is not being exercised by who buys the most. It's being exercised by who can leave without collapsing the room. That's the leverage. When one actor decides an asset is no longer protection, but exposure, the system doesn't crack immediately. It compensates. Others step in. Numbers still add up, which is why this doesn't feel like a crisis yet. But systems held together by substitution rather than confidence don't fail loudly at first. They thin. They stretch. And once you see who is no longer willing to hold the weight, you start to see why the next shift won't be voluntary. Because the control mechanism hasn't disappeared. It's just changing hands. The most dangerous changes in a system are the ones that arrive without resistance because they feel familiar. There was a time when this structure worked because everyone accepted the same bargain. Trade produced surplus. Surplus recycled into paper. Paper promised stability. Before, that loop was slow, predictable, almost boring. Now it isn't. What changed wasn't a rule. It was a belief. The belief that integration was permanent, that participation guaranteed protection, that being inside the system made you safer than being outside it. That belief is quietly being revised, not in speeches, not in communique, but in duration, in exposure, in how long someone is willing to stay locked in. And here's the part that's easy to miss. Nothing about this shift looks irrational. It's framed as adjustment, as prudence, as normal diversification. That's why it went unnoticed for so long. But slow exits are only invisible until they reach a point where speed becomes necessary. And once that happens, the system doesn't ask why anymore. It only asks who's still holding. Here's where the abstraction breaks. Because buried inside a document almost no one reads, a number quietly crossed a line it hadn't touched in more than a decade. On paper, it still looks enormous, comfortingly large, the kind of figure that reassures rather than alarms. But context is everything. This wasn't a trim. It wasn't a rebalance. It wasn't even defensive caution. This happened while prices were down, while selling meant locking in losses, while patience would have been cheaper. That matters, because institutions that plan to stay don't do that. They wait. They stretch time. They protect optionality. Choosing loss over delay tells you something else is being priced in. Not return, not yield. Risk of immobilization. And when an actor that large accepts pain now to avoid exposure later, the transaction stops being financial. It becomes directional. If you're still treating this as a market story, this is the moment to pause. Stay with me. Because the next question isn't why sell, it's who had to step in the instant they did. And that answer changes everything. When that weight started coming off, it didn't disappear. It transferred. Markets like to pretend they're impersonal. They aren't. They always choose a holder. And in this case, the holder wasn't the most efficient buyer. It wasn't the most profitable one. It was the most obligated. This is how the mechanism works. When a position becomes politically sensitive, it doesn't clear at a fair price. It clears through relationships, through alignment, through pressure that never shows up in a spreadsheet. Someone absorbs the exposure not because they want the asset, but because they can't afford the alternative. So the system stays upright. Rates don't spike the way they should. Headlines stay calm. But the cost doesn't vanish. It migrates from actors with surplus to actors with limits, from economic buyers to political ones. And that distinction matters because economic buyers exit when returns disappear. Political buyers exit when stability at home is threatened. That means the question is no longer whether the system can function. It's how long it can function like this before the damage stops being exportable. And that's where the next fracture starts to form. This is where the pace changes. Because the system isn't just absorbing weight now, it's straining under it. You can see it in the anomalies. The unnatural steadiness, the way nothing breaks when it should, that's not resilience. That's intervention. When supply rises and prices don't respond, something else is acting in the background. Coordination replaces price discovery. Stability replaces truth. And that works right up until it doesn't. Because every forced purchase concentrates risk. Every substitution narrows the margin for error. Every quiet fix increases the cost of the next one. This is no longer about confidence. It's about capacity. How much weight can be held by actors who weren't built to hold it? And here's the problem. The moment one of them needs liquidity for themselves, this arrangement reverses instantly. Not slowly, not politely, all at once. That's the fragility hiding inside the calm. A system that looks solid only as long as no one else panics. And when the first one does, the exit stops being orderly. This is where it stops being abstract. Because the system doesn't break on screens, it breaks in lives. When stability is being purchased somewhere else, it's being removed from you. You feel it as higher costs that don't come with higher pay, as services that thin out instead of improving, as a sense that the math no longer works, even though you didn't change your behavior. That's not coincidence. When risk is exported upward, the pressure moves downward. It shows up as postponed projects, delayed hiring, quiet cuts that never make announcements. And here's the part no one says plainly. You are not the priority variable in this system. You are the buffer. If you felt like the ground rules shifted without your consent, that's because they did. Stay with me here. This matters because once this dynamic moves beyond borders, once it stops being containable inside a few balance sheets, the effects don't stay domestic. They ripple, and the next place they surface won't feel familiar at all. Once this dynamic leaves its home market, it changes character because systems built on substitution work only when the circle is small, when the same actors can keep passing the weight to one another, when trust still travels faster than fear. That condition is no longer guaranteed. As exposure shifts across borders, it starts distorting other systems. Currencies feel it first. Trade flows next. Then politics, not through announcements, through pressure. Alliances that were built for coordination become conduits for stress. Every forced adjustment in one place creates an imbalance somewhere else. And those imbalances don't ask permission. They show up as volatility that doesn't match local conditions, as policy responses that feel premature, as populations reacting to outcomes they didn't choose. This is how a financial issue stops being theirs and starts being everyone's, not because of contagion, but because of dependence. And once multiple systems begin compensating at the same time, no one is quite sure who is absorbing whom anymore. That uncertainty is the tell, because it means the next phase won't be coordinated. It will be reactive. From here, the system has three possible trajectories, not predictions, pressures. The first is adjustment. Actors accept lower returns, higher risk, and tighter margins. In exchange for continuity, the system shrinks, but it holds. Stability becomes more expensive, and fewer people can afford it. That path looks calm on the surface, until it isn't. The second is erosion. Confidence fades unevenly. Participation becomes conditional. Support remains in place, but only barely. This is the slow grind, the kind that doesn't break headlines, but rewrites expectations year by year. Nothing collapses. Everything degrades. Then there's rupture. Not a single event, a sequence. One actor reaches a limit. Another responds defensively. Liquidity vanishes where it's needed most. At that point, the system stops choosing outcomes. It reacts to them. Which path emerges doesn't depend on intent. It depends on timing, on coincidence, on who needs flexibility first. And that's the part no one controls. Because once acceleration begins, decisions are no longer strategic. They're forced. Here's the mistake people make at this stage. They wait for confirmation, for a headline, for a moment that feels like a turning point. But systems like this don't announce failure. They normalize it. By the time the language changes, the structure already has. What you're watching isn't a collapse. It's a reclassification. Assets that once meant safety now mean alignment. Participation now comes with conditions. And the danger isn't that this is happening. It's that it's happening quietly enough for most people to mistake it for stability. Nothing here requires panic, but it does require attention. Because once neutrality disappears from the system, every choice becomes directional. Even the ones that don't feel political, especially those. So don't look for reassurance. Look for movement. Watch what's being exited, who's being asked to compensate, and which risks are no longer being priced, honestly. If you want to understand what comes next, you have to keep tracking the part of the story that never shows up as breaking news. Stay with me. This isn't the end of the mechanism. It's just the point where it stops pretending to be invisible